My name is Matthew Fisher. I've recently completed a Master of Research degree in history at the University of Portsmouth, where my final dissertation was on a religious controversy regarding Victorian ritualist slum priests. But on the 1st of July 2020, I presented a paper called Robert Hoadley Ashe versus Samuel Lane, separated by 8 miles in a theological chasm. It was subtitled A Search for Nuance Amongst the Theological Divide of Early 19th Century Millenarian and Calvinism. It was a paper about two people. It was one who was a Calvinist who wrote a pamphlet of over 100 pages against a gentleman who was the curate of the church about 8 miles away. The paper concentrated on how religion and religious motivation is downplayed in society. And if you think about accessible local history websites and presentations, they often have the call for no religion and no politics. But really, if we go back 200 years, which is where we're going to 1811, just over 200 years, religion played a massive part, a huge part in what people thought. The religious belief was not dead or dry, but it actually affected everything they did. So in Yeovil Library, there is a book which is over 100-page pamphlet written in 1811 about a small rural area of southwestern England, written by Calvinist Samuel Lane to South Cottian, who was a very well-educated Reverend Dr. Robert Hoadley Ashe. We don't know a huge deal about Samuel Lane. According to Joanna Southcott, who responded to Samuel Lane in one of her writings, said that he was a Calvinistic preacher. He wrote about Robert Hoadley Ashe, who was 50 years a curate just 8 miles away in Crewkerne. He is actually buried by the church door in Crewkerne churchyard. Hopkins tells us that South Somerset was a hotbed of South Cottian activity, and also a cottage of worship was established in virtually every village in the locality. Robert Hoadley Ashe was a devotee of Joanna Southcott, the prophetess, and this made him very unpopular in his parish. So I thought surely I could find some things about him. But in Yeovil, I found nothing. In Crewkerne Church, nothing. Crewkerne Museum, nothing. Newspapers, nothing really. But whilst I was researching the drains of Yeovil, who wouldn't love to do that, I stumbled upon this pamphlet by Samuel Lane, who writes his theological argument against Joanna Southcott and Robert Hoadley Ashe. It's really a theological text which could be described as Calvinism versus Millenarianism, or a post-millennial view of the second coming of Jesus versus a premillennial imminent view that Jesus was coming back soon. He believed that God had stopped speaking. Samuel Lane would be called today a cessationist, whereas Joanna Southcott and Robert Hoadley Ashe would be called perhaps a charismatic or a continuationist. And really, this is where their theology divides so much that they denounce each other as heretics. So Lane appeals to Calvinistic academic Dr. John Gill, who was a pastor of New Street Chapel, predecessor to Charles Spurgeon, and his whole pamphlet, Samuel Lane, is arguing against the interpretation of the Bible, the interpretation of the Christian and Hebrew scriptures that Joanna Southcott incorporated. So actually, there's an interesting debate here, because we have a Bible versus the Bible argument. And you might think, well, maybe that doesn't have a lot of relevance today and isn't really worth a great deal. But if you watch YouTube videos, if you look at people like Jacob Prasch of Moriel, who's very millenarian, or Justin Peters, a Calvinistic Southern Baptist, they talk to each other, or maybe more likely talk at each other, because like today, these articles and videos, Samuel Lane's pamphlet in the same way was made clearly for people who agreed with him. Yes, surely Robert Hoadley Ashe would hear about it, and if you read the pamphlet, then you will see that he does hear about it, because halfway through, Samuel Lane tells us Robert Hoadley Ashe's response to it. But in much the same way, Jacob Prasch versus Justin Peters. Both these people describe themselves as Christians. Both these people describe themselves as evangelical. And I wonder if that is a useful term. But in the same way, Samuel Lane and Robert Hoadley Ashe were both described themselves as Christians, both described themselves as ministers of the gospel. So really, the primary relevance of Lane's writing and Southcott's response to this, they are arguing a distinctly opposing theological position of continuationism and cessationism, but they're arguing it from the same source. So rather than it being one person believes in the Bible and one person doesn't, they're both believing that the Bible is the source of where the theological belief comes from. So the theological beliefs of Lane, Ashe, and Southcott, they motivated how they lived their lives and what they wrote. And this made them popular amongst their followers, but were disregarded and were viewed as unpopular and unlikable and often heretical amongst their enemies. So here we have three texts that could easily be viewed one side by side together. We have The Strange Effect of Faith by Joanna Southcott, which Samuel Lane repeatedly quotes from, or maybe misquotes from. And then we have Lane's pamphlet with his Calvinistic agenda being pushed through, his post-millennial agenda. So his view of Jesus coming back is that Jesus will come back to a triumphant church. So we have The Strange Effect of Faith by Joanna Southcott, how Lane then treats that in his pamphlet, and then Joanna Southcott's response. To me, just finally, in conclusion, I was thinking, if you are a resident of South Somerset, then this is a really exciting, interesting argument. It certainly makes Yeovil and Crewkerne, these 8 miles apart, more interesting because Samuel Lane ministered to his congregation in Yeovil and Robert Hoadley Ashe to his in Crewkerne, both within what may be considered Orthodox Christianity. So as we consider Samuel Lane and the Reverend Dr. Robert Hoadley Ashe, I think it's important to remind ourselves that religious controversy and religious debate and religious disagreement were a very real, tangible issue in the early 19th century, even in rural South Somerset.